Greetings, friends. We have with us today Comrade Martin Ralph from the UK. He's a Trotskyist and a union organizer in Britain. Comrade Martin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I guess I've been a trade unionist for about 50 years, so I've seen a lot of changes in this country. And I've been a Trotskyist for many of those years as well. A long time in the service of working class struggle, I would say. So I live in Liverpool, which has a very militant history of the working class. Of course, all struggles go up and down. But I can tell you about what's happening here and across the nations of the UK as well during the interview.
Right. So in the news today, we have one of the largest, perhaps the largest railway strike in recent history of Britain. There are thousands of railway workers going on strike for these several days now. I think the strike has just ended. Yes.
No, it's had 3 days of strike, and they are meeting this week to decide when the next days of strike will be.
Okay, so it's going on. It's like a rolling plan.
Yes.
Achha. So can you give us some background about the British Railway? It used to be in public hands, then it got privatized. How did that process happen, and what kind of consequences were there of such
right? Well, I think maybe just after the Second World War, the railways were in such a mess because they were run for profit. They weren't working properly, and they needed bailing out by the government. But at the same time, there was a strong feeling in the working class for public ownership. Actually, at that point, the Labour Party had this demand, the public ownership owned by the workers of Britain. So it became privatized, and then it continued that way until really Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979. And clearly she had a strong program of privatization and trying to return back from the gains that workers had made in the previous decades, so that it was privatized in the 1980s. And it was privatized in a way that would make it very difficult to renationalize, certainly from the state point of view. I would say that I'm in favor of renationalization, but as I say to the workers on the picket line this week, the best people to know how to run a railway and how to control it are workers themselves and the interested parties of the workers who have to travel. So it was broken up and into many different companies, maybe 30 or more separate companies. The track from London to the northwest, the track from London to Scotland, or from London to Bristol could all be in separate hands. And then who was going to work on the maintenance of the railways? That could be another private company. So it was splintered into different companies. And so at that point, there was after that process, there was a strike about 30 years ago. But it didn't manage to fight for and win renationalization of the rails. So it's been run for a very long time now, since Margaret Thatcher, as a private system. And what does that mean? Well, just a little bit further back from now, 2013 to 2019, their shareholders were given £1 billion pounds in just payment. That's the kind of profit that these railway systems were making. And to give a very stark example, we had COVID, like yourselves here, and the COVID situation for rail workers was they continued, often without proper health and safety equipment for COVID, they continued full-time running the trains and doing the guard work and doing all the other tasks which railways need to be done by workers. What were they given for this? They were given a wage freeze. So for 3 years, they had no wage increase whatsoever. However, in December 2021, the private companies gave their shareholders more or less 800 million pounds in terms of what the railways were making out of profit. So huge sums are put into this system to keep the privatized companies happy. And where they don't make money, the government will put in extra money. There's all kinds of complicated agreements with the government. So that's the kind of background. Naked capitalism, we run the railways for profit, and we don't really care about the actual workers themselves, as we'll come on to see in terms of this new situation that they're facing. But that gives you the history of the situation. And I would say that the RMT are one of the most militant unions in the UK today, both in relation to the metro workers in London and also mainline rails across the country. So they are a tremendous fighting body of men and women workers. And in the situation in Britain, as I said, one of the leading sections of workers.
It is fascinating, Comrade. Just to be clear, workers' wages have not risen at all during this time when the shareholders were given billions and hundreds of millions of pounds worth of profit.
Certainly since COVID, so we're going back now 2.5 years, no wage. In fact, the RMT say it's 3 years, but even before then, there wouldn't be massive wage increases. They'd be very small, quite insignificant compared to the money being paid to the shareholders.
And if I'm to understand it correctly, Comrade, there is an inflationary situation in Britain, like the rest of the European Union, right?
Yes, in fact, it's worse. I just seen an advert about the fact that French rail workers are going on strike because inflation, I think they were saying, is about 5%, and by the end of the year, it's going to be 10%. But already in this country, we have inflation of 10%. In fact, in many cases, it's more. And it's very clear that the poorer workers who depend on benefits and even go to places where they can get free food, their inflation is much higher, maybe 14, 15%, because the lowest paid workers will use a system of paying for gas and electricity, which is pay as you go. You have to fill in up a card every week or every month. And so life is very hard. But yesterday I was listening to a chat show about someone running, producing food. And they said in some of their ingredients has got up 40%. So it's quite varied, but everybody agrees that the inflation at this moment is 10%. And since January, it's gone up every month. So the rate of inflation is increasing at the moment. And as you say, first of all, it's got nothing to do with the conditions amongst the workers. This is an international phenomenon throughout Europe and the United States. So yes, it's a cost of living crisis. And let me say that the TUC, which takes sometimes many years to react to situations, in this case, not last Saturday, the Saturday before, on the 18th of June, they organized a demonstration to fight against what they call the cost of living crisis. And certainly at least 60,000, maybe 70,000 workers took to the streets of London just on the 18th of June to fight against this rising cost of fuel, food, and energy.
It's fascinating. What is the political situation around the strike like? I mean, obviously the Conservatives and the other right-wing parties are going to be virulently against it, but among the left-wing and center parties like the Labour and the Liberal Democrats, what's the approach to this strike like?
Well, it's one, in a sense, let me put it this way, it's one of the great achievements of such a strong strike, with such support from other trade unions and activists, that it's forced the political parties to make their position clear. So you may be surprised that the Liberal Democrats, one of their leaders on a BBC chat show, called for the army to be brought in to be able to run the rail works, since the strike was going ahead. And of course, all strikes create difficulties, but you know, the way they presented it was the Liberal Democrats were clearly against the strike. They partly blamed the government, but then they said, we think that the army should be approached. So they want to break the strike, undoubtedly. The Labour Party is, again, it's divided. But Keir Starmer, the new leader who took over from Jeremy Corbyn, made it very clear that none of his front benchers should be attending any picket line. And there's a guy, a Labour MP in London, who repeated that. His name is Lammy, his surname is Lammy, and he made it very clear that no responsible leadership of the Labour Party should be seen attending any pickets, not only RMT, but any pickets whatsoever. So they, of course, they end at the they put at the end, oh, but we support the workers. Well, of course, they don't support the workers, because I was speaking at the rally in Liverpool, where there were about 300 turned up. We had many rallies across the country. And I made the point that if you say you support a worker on strike, then you're on the picket line. If you're not on the picket line, then it's just hot air, you know. But it's quite interesting. It may have shocked some people who support the Labour Party that it's so strongly against this particular struggle, where clearly the RMT, you know, ordinary men and women workers, they don't go on strike easily. It creates a lot of problems for them, but they obviously cannot, they either accept, one of the demands, for example, is we reserve the right to have compulsory redundancies. Well, no union in the world can accept that kind of position. So it's they've been forced to come out on strike. And to be honest, because of the response of the government, I mean, if I could just take a little time, because I mean, it's comical and very serious at the same time, when their first attempt was to slander and ridicule the leadership of the RMT, Mick Lynch, who handled himself very well, but they were accused of not being prepared to negotiate. And this again was on the media, on TV. And every time the Shapps, who was the Tory responsible for running the railways, or not running them, as the case may be, but he made these accusations against Mick Lynch, and Mick Lynch just said, that's a lie. No, you're lying. Actually, you're a liar. And he said that 300 times, because every sentence that came out of this Tory MP's mouth was just a lie. And he's done that many, many times over the last few days. So he's actually kind of electrified, if you like, the fight here. And it is very interesting. Apparently, there's a TUC web page, which is all about how do I join a union? And then within the hour after Mick Lynch had spoken on one of the medias, the number of people wanting to join a union in that 1 hour went up 184%. So it's very interesting. These are hard attacks, but the RMT are proving very capable of standing up and answering them and taking no nonsense. One other comic thing was when one of the journalists on TV interviewed Mick standing by a picket. The picket had 5 or 6 people there. And she said, are your pickets going to stop workers going into work? And he said, well, that's the purpose of a picket. Yes, we will ask them not to go to work. We'll try to change their mind. And she said, how are you going to do that? She was obviously trying to paint the picture that these pickets were thugs and were carrying whatever weapons, or they were just standing there talking quietly. And that's what they were doing. And so the whole thing became a farce. And after a few days, they gave up because they couldn't win in that way. So no doubt they'll come up with some other ideas as well. But the RMT are saying to all the trade unionists that are supporting them, you are giving us also the strength. So that the activists who are there on the picket lines every day, well, there's been, the way they did it, they had one day of strike, then not, and then a second day of strike. So it was Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday when they had the strike action going on right across the country. We had, I'm in the International Socialist League, so we had comrades in London and Cambridge and Swansea and Manchester and so on, and they were all saying the same thing. Very great number of RMT workers on the picket line and many people supporting them. So it was good. And I think most important, I should say, about Mick Lynch, he stood on the TUC demonstration and he made the speech and he said, I hope many more unions will organize national strike action against this government, because it is widely known that they're just removing our rights all the time. Every week it's going, especially this year, they've passed many laws which, when they start to implement them, could virtually make it illegal to organize a demonstration. This idea about if you make too much noise, or you have to ask their permission, you have to ask their permission to start, you have to ask their permission to stop. So when they begin to start, it's going to be very fiery, I think. But these are not empty words, because the CWU, which are postal workers, they're going to be balloted very soon. And that's 165,000 workers who will be balloted for strike action over the cost of living and other things. And then there's Rolls-Royce, 6 or 7 sites. Certainly they're moving into a ballot situation because in so many cases, inflation, as I said, is 10% or more, and they're offered 2% or 3%. And one of the slogans from the Rolls-Royce workers was 8 or gate. And what that meant is either 8% now or gate, meaning we leave through the gate. In other words, give us 8% or we strike. So, and these are many workers who've suffered the same kind of thing. That in the last few years, wage rises have been held down for many years. And don't forget, this comes yet 2 years of COVID. And then before that, 10 years of austerity. Many local authority services and workers have gone. And the National Health Service that did just such a tremendous job. The nurses and the doctors, they were called heroes, and people went on streets every week to clap the heroes, the nurses. And what have they been given? More or less a wage freeze. So, what I mean, people are now sick to death of these kind of hot air speakers, the holiday speakers, the people who make the holiday speeches. So I think maybe went on more than what you asked. So just to finish that off, obviously there are some Labour MPs joining the picket lines, making the speeches in support of the strike. So, important to record that. So clearly there are very, very deep divisions in the Labour Party. I won't go into it, but I think this could be the beginning, the thing that begins the process where many more people think, oh, we need to build a new workers' party, like they did in 1900, 1903, and so on. That's another topic. But I think that this thing is such, what they do say is the rail workers think that the government is so intransigent that this struggle could continue for many weeks, if not months. And that's why they're calling other workers to take action, because it's not on the lips of any of the union leaders at the moment. But when we went down to London on the 18th of June, we said, we think the TUC should organize a national conference for organizing national strike action. And that quickly became a discussion about the need for the TUC to organize a general strike. And everyone we asked, could be a postal worker, could be a nurse, could be a teacher, anyone that we stopped and talked to, and we did that for about 2 hours, they all said, who said about the organize a general strike, and they went, yeah, of course. So that's not being articulated by the leaders at the moment, but nevertheless, the kind of, well, of course, it wasn't, I think it's the kind of thing that they were already thinking about, but it's not yet expressed. So obviously one does not know how quickly these things can develop. But
can you just give us a summary of what their main demands are? It's just a summary of their main demands.
Yes. First of all, to remove the element of compulsory redundancies. The strike will continue if they continue to say we must have the right to make workers compulsory redundant. That's the first thing. The second thing is over the ticket offices. In many stations, there are ticket offices, and the government wants to close them all. Just get rid of them. So that's of course why they want compulsory redundancy. So that's also why we say the public is going to have, if that happens, it's going to be a huge mess for the traveling public. But and for the health and safety, I've stood on one of the picket lines I stood on this last week was a maintenance depot. There were 20 workers there on the picket lines. So we had a very good and detailed discussion. And they said they want to reduce our teams much more, maybe 50%. And so they want to reduce the number of checks that are being made. That is the tradition, certainly over the last few decades. So they want to maintain that there is a very strong fight for health and safety on the rails, which the government and the employers want to remove. So that's another thing. They want to reform the pensions. I say reform, it means cutting the pensions. So that's another central demand, hands off any attempt to worsen the pension schemes that they have. And of course, there's an element there of a wage increase. But because they've been suffering a wage freeze for 3 years, then they've rejected like the 2.5% or 3% offer. So other workers are accepting 7% or 10%. It's around there. But those, I think, are the main demands. That's why the strike is on. That's what they're fighting for.
So if I'm to understand it, in this strike, at this stage, nationalization is not on the table. The demand for that is.
Yeah, you're right. It's not being talked about. Clearly, like in our organization, the International Socialist League, we explained the need for renationalization under workers' control, but it's not getting, at this moment, it's not getting, it's like one of those things that if you stand up in front of a few thousand workers and say, the railways must be renationalized, everybody would applaud it and be very happy with that demand. Definitely. But that's not really being articulated by the sort of union leaders at the moment. Even if it's bound to be national policy, you know, something they discuss at a Congress and vote for to renationalize. But obviously, in a living struggle, these demands can emerge much more strongly. You know, especially if I mean, they have to continue. They have to decide to continue or not. They obviously, other workers have to decide whether to organize the strike actions or not.
So,
but
to understand it correctly, Comrade, is nationalization being talked about in the speeches before the picket lines and such? Is it being raised at that level?
It's not as part of it. It's not a strong part of the speeches. But for people like myself, I mean, it was we had a number of different unions speaking and women's organizations and so on. And that will have been mentioned, but that's all it is at this moment. It's not stronger than that at this moment. Of course, that can change quite quickly.
Right. And just a 5-minute note on the things that you mentioned earlier about the nature in which privatized railway is organized. There are different segments and different sectors of the railway divided among different companies. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
So coordination will be a complete mess if this is the case.
Yes, it's well, your point really brings up, there are something like 20 companies, workers who were working for 20 different rail companies were balloted. And one would have to explain the draconian anti-trade union laws in this country that have been developed both by Tory and Labour since the 1970s. Today, if you are in a workplace, then 50% of the workers in a workplace have to participate in the ballot if the ballot is to be recognized and a legal ballot. And of those who are participating, then the number voting for strike action has to be 50%. So if 49% of workers vote for strike action, it's not going to happen. It would be illegal, or it would have to be a wildcat strike. So that is why only 13 companies are being hit by strike action, because there wasn't sufficient numbers voting to get strike action in the other 7. Having said that, I would just to say that, of course, there are different unions. The RMT is the biggest transport union in the country, but the train drivers, not all of them, but the majority of them, if they're in a union, will be organized by another union, which itself is organizing strike action in 2 or 3 different places. But that's why this whole question about coordination comes up. So that's what's happening. So not every member of the RMT is on strike at the moment because of the reasons I said.
That is a very interesting point, comrade. But I was also thinking in terms of how the railways managed itself. Because earlier, I imagine there would be a singular system. There would be a efficiency in that single centralized system. Now it is broken up.
Yeah.
So you'll probably have different rates being decided by the different balance sheets of the different companies. So that would be a major difficulty for the average worker who would rely on the railway to travel.
Yes. Yes. No, exactly. I mean, in London, you have like the King's Cross railway station, which is a famous station. Up the road, you have Euston, and it's two different companies. So you, it's a crazy system. But again, let's say that part of the problem of this is that each company, of course, is trying to cut costs and make its profit as high as possible and give as much money to the shareholders. So now and again, in various places, they base their work on precarious workers. And often they can be, it's a terrible word, but according to the government and the law, they could be illegal workers because they don't have papers to exist in this country. That's why we say no one is illegal. But the RMT have had quite a tradition of organizing illegal workers, those who don't have any rights, because many of them are cleaners or they work in somewhat of the basic tasks. So the RMT does what it can to organize them, and they have organized strikes also in the past.
This is very important, because in the Indian context, there are many parallels here. On the one hand, you just mentioned King's Cross station and another station.
Mm-hmm.
Here, the stations are starting to get privatized. The full privatization of the railway is not on the cards yet, because it's an extremely important and vital means of transport for people and goods. And this is of a great strategic value for the security of the country. So the privatization is happening in a creeping fashion. And one of the outcomes of this has been the increase in use of contract and casual labor. Basically, you were hired on a contract basis or casualized, where they don't have permanent tenures. So we are seeing the first symptoms of privatization, which is already there in Britain.
Yes.
With contract labor, precarious work, the worsening of conditions, and eventually the fragmentation of the railway system itself. So these things are a reality of Britain that India is potentially staring at.
Yeah. Just a few comments on that. Very clearly, it's important in India to organize and combine the unions against the use of precarious work. And obviously we had apprenticeships that would last for some years. So when young workers finish the apprenticeship, they would at least have enough skill to understand what was needed and continue in their working life. Here, the precarious workers, what rights do you have? Well, actually, you don't have any rights, because now what they've done here is like the Deliveroo or other places, and they're doing it all the time. Same thing in France. They go, well, no, you don't work for us. You're self-employed. But they wear all the gear. They do it. Of course, they're working for them. But it means pension. No, you don't have a pension. That's gone. What happens if you're sick? Well, you don't get any money. That's the situation in this country now. And obviously that's what they want to do. I'm sure it's happening in many countries. But if it hasn't, if in the Indian railway system, it hasn't happened yet, it's now on the cards. And of course, all of that will undermine the wages, conditions, and so on of those rail workers that have won those conditions and so on, obviously over the years by their struggle. So this is another way to remove that. I'll just give one more shout out for the General Secretary of the RMT, because he said on Saturday, he was traveling to different meetings and he made the point, and this is the first time I've heard a General Secretary say this. He said, no one is illegal. Do not try to pitch a rail worker against a nurse or a cleaner against a porter. We are a rainbow and everyone is welcome here to come and work. And I never heard that said before. We've said it, but you know, it's a different thing.
Our words are spreading.
Yeah, definitely.
On that note, Comrade, we have only 2 minutes left of the recording time.
Okay.
So let us
Sure.
conclude on that.
Yes.
This is a very important and historical strike which is happening in Britain. It is, as I interpret it, and based on what we've discussed, it is also a strike on the privatization of rails. And in essence, it is a callback to nationalization, even if it is not on the cards. In essence, it is against the systemic exploitation of the railway workers and of the working class as a whole, because
Absolutely.
the railway
Absolutely.
goes, it affects everyone.
Yes.
So Britain's present is the future that the right-wing government, which is presently ruling in India, is actually wishing for.
Yeah.
Modi is India's Thatcher in that sense. And
Yeah.
he would definitely want what Thatcher had achieved in Britain. And it is one reason why I believe that it is a great inspiration for us to see this strike and to see its success. So from our end to yours, we wish you all the success in this strike, comrades, and solidarity with the striking railway workers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll pass those words on. And if it's at all possible to get solidarity from rail workers in India, it would be great to make those connections.
Absolutely, comrade. Let us work towards it.
Okay.
Lal Salam,
But
missionary greetings.